Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Shabbos Daf Kufim Gimel begins with the Mishnah, which discusses primarily the halachos of muktzah, and then it takes us to the end of the Amud, the half of the Daf, which ends Perek HaNoitel, the 21st Perek of Masechta Shabbos, all discussing primarily halachos muktzah. And we begin the next Perek, which is a Perek Chavis that has a number of different halachos in the Mishnah. It talks a little bit about squeezing, and it's primarily focusing on the rules of squeezing juice out of fruits, which will be what the rest of the Daf will be about. So first of all, as an introduction to this Mishnah, which begins our Daf, or a few lines into the Daf, we have to remember that there's a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon about general muktzah. When something changes its function on Shabbos from one function to another, Rabbi Shimon says that that's not muktzah, and Rabbi Yehuda says it is function. It is muktzah. Now, a good example of that is when something changes from human food to animal food, or vice versa. Now, human food has waste within it, but as long as the waste is still attached to it, like the shells of the nuts, or the peels of the eggs, or crumbs of bread, that's all human food. It's considered to be part of the object that it's in. Once the food is used and the waste is left behind, and that's only fitting for animals, that just changed from human food to animal food. So that would be the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. According to Rabbi Yehuda, that would be muktzah now, because it changed function. According to Rabbi Shimon, it would not be muktzah. That's primarily what this daf is about. The Mishnah begins by quoting machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Strangely, Beis Shammai seems to be going l'kula, like Rabbi Shimon. And they say that if you have bones or shells of nuts on the table after the meal, so that's not muktzah, you're allowed to take it off with your hands. Beis Hillel says no, it's muktzah, you have to turn the table over and shake it onto the floor. Next halach is crumbs. That is also changed from human food to animal food when you made crumbs, but these are where they're less than a concise or anything that size. Or also in this list here is the stalks of beans or stalks of lentils, things like that. Here we don't have a machlokes quoted, we just have a stam Mishnah. The Gemara says that it's not muktzah because it's animal food, which again sounds like Reb Shimon. Now on a different subject, the Gemara says if you want to clean the table off, once we're discussing cleaning it off, you want to use a sponge. Again, the sponge here is not this; it's not holding water that you're squeezing onto the table. It's soaking up spilled water on the table. So you got to hold it in a way that you're not going to squeeze some of the water out of it, because that would be schita, an issur of schita. The only way to do that is if it has a hard handle made out of leather. If you have to hold the sponge part, so then you're certainly going to squeeze it. You would not be allowed to use it to clean the water off the table on Shabbos. So Gemara says whether it has the handle or it doesn't have the handle, it's not muktzah, and it is not mekabel tumah. Okay, so let's see the Gemara here. The Gemara says, first of all, this understanding of the machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, that Beis Shammai goes l'kula like Reb Shimon, is flipped. We're going to flip it around and say our understanding is that it's the other way. Beis Shammai goes l'chumra like Rabbi Yehuda, and Beis Hillel goes l'kula like Rabbi Shimon. Okay, as far as cleaning off the crumbs, that seems to support Rabbi Yechanan's opinion, who says that you have to take care of crumbs even smaller than a kazayis. You can't make sure that you cannot just destroy them and throw them out. As far as the heads of the stalks here, this was a stam and mishnah that sounds like it is Reb Shimon, because we said that the crumbs, the heads of stalks, all these things are animal food, and therefore they are not muktzah. That's Reb Shimon's opinion. The Gemara says, but then hold on a second. If it's Reb Shimon, then what's the problem with the sponge? You're squeezing, even if you hold the sponge with your fingers and you squeeze water out, that's Eina Miskaven. Reb Shimon holds Eina Miskaven is not a problem. The Gemara says, no, this is Psik Reisha, like we know Abaya and Rava say, anytime where the malacha is for sure going to happen, you can't say, I didn't intend for it to happen. And therefore, even Reb Shimon would say it's usher, so this is really Reb Shimon, but it's usher to hold the sponge by the sponge part anyway. Okay, let's talk about the pits of the dates after you eat the dates. So it depends on what quality of date you had. If the date was low quality and it was animal food all along, so it was animal food the whole time. Even if you gotten rid of the fruit, the pit is now still animal food. It hasn't changed. It's not a muktzah. That is Aramean dates. If, however, you had high quality dates, which were called Persian dates, so those are people food until you eat it, and then the pits that are left are animal food. So that would be muktzah according to Rabbi Yehuda. So what do you do with that? So the Gemara lists a number of Amoraim and how they moved it using various heter devices of kalach yad or graf shel rei. Where it says that Shmuel moved it with a piece of bread. Shmuel holds you allowed to use bread for all kinds of things. You don't have to worry about disgracing the bread. Rabbah, who is probably Rava here, depending on the girsa, moved it with a bucket of water. Rav Huna Breder of Yeshua, he held it was a graf sharei, a huge pile of chewed up dates with the pits left over is disgusting, and therefore that you're allowed to move. Graf sharei is anything that's disgusting which you're allowed to move away from where you live, your living room. Rav Ashi says, no, you can't make a graf sharei. You're not allowed to set up a situation of graf sharei, so you wouldn't be allowed to put the pits there in the first place. Rav Sheshes flicked them away with his tongue. Rav Papa threw it behind his chair. That's the type of shinoi. And it was Chaya ben Avkilis, who features greatly in the Kamsa Bar Kamsa story. Rav Chaya ben Avkilis would turn his face facing behind the chair, and then he would throw them away normally wherever they went. That's the end of Perek Noitel, and now we begin Perek Chavis. The opening Mishnah in Perek Chavis is primarily concerned with the halachas of squeezing. So first of all, it talks about what happens when a barrel of wine breaks. So the halacha is that you're allowed to technically save the wine. You can scoop it up. There isn't any problem. We're just afraid that you're going to end up sponging it up. Sponging it up will lead you to squeeze it, and that will be an issue. So Chachamim were afraid that you were going to do that, and therefore they forbade you to save too much. And this is similar to the rule of not saving too much from a burning fire. Whenever there's a significant monetary loss involved, they limited how much you can save because people would be too twisted into knots trying to save their money. They'd be too upset and too nervous about it. They would end up doing malachas. Like this, we restricted how much you can save, and you wouldn't end up doing any malachas. So you're only allowed to save enough for 3 meals, but you're allowed to call other people to come and save part of the wine that's dripping from the broken barrel for themselves. Now it says clearly you have to be careful not to squeeze it, not to sponge it up, because you may come to squeeze. As far as actually squeezing fruits, so there's two types of there are two ways to categorize fruits. There are fruits that their general purpose is for squeezing. So that's olives, which are generally squeezed for oil, and grapes, which are generally squeezed to make wine. Other fruits are not generally used for squeezing. On the other hand, there's another way of categorizing fruits, and that is, are you referring to fruits that you put aside, you stored up because you intend to eat them, or you intended to squeeze them? What was your intended plan for these fruits? So, first of all, it says clearly, the Mishnah says you're not allowed to squeeze any types of fruits according to anybody. That's a malacha, it's a tolda of dash. The question is, what happens if water, if juice, wine, oil, whatever it is, drips out of the fruits on their own? So, the Mishnah does not distinguish between what type of fruit it is. It distinguishes between why you store the fruits. Rabbi Huda says, if you store them up because you wanted to squeeze them, then you can't use any wine that drips from it, or any oil that drips from it, or anything, or any juice that drips from it, because if you would be allowed to use those, then you may end up squeezing it on Shabbos. Like this, if we say, listen, any juice that comes out of there on a Shabbos you can't use, then there will be no reason to squeeze any of it on Shabbos, because you can't even use the juice that drips out on its own on Shabbos. So Rabbi Yehuda says that only applies to fruits that you're planning on squeezing. If you're not planning on squeezing it, then you're not happy that the juice ran out. Just because, even if we allow you to use the juice, you wouldn't be happy about it. Why would you go to squeeze more? And the Chachamim disagree. The Chachamim say it doesn't matter what the reason you store them for. Either way, whether you store them for food or you store them for squeezing, either way it's forbidden to use the juice that drips out, because you may end up squeezing more on Shabbos. Now, another thing which was commonly had liquid removed from it was honey. Honeycombs, the way they got the honey out was they ground up the honeycomb. Now you had a mix of the wax of the honeycomb with the oil, and then they left it to drip. The honey would drip out over Shabbos. So there's no squeezing involved. But if you have honey dripping out of the honeycomb, Rabbi Eliezer says it's mutter. You don't have to worry about. There isn't anything you could do. You're not going to squeeze it. There's no squeezing. You don't usually squeeze it. However, the Chachamim say no. We still don't let you use the honey that drips out of the honeycomb, because you may come to grind the honeycomb further on Shabbos. Okay, so in all these situations, the Chachamim say it's always forbidden to use what drips out. Rabbi Yehuda says if it's fruits stored for food, then it's not a problem, and Rabbi Eliezer says if it's a honeycomb, you're not going to squeeze it, and we're not afraid that you're going to come to grind it. Okay. Now the Gemara talks about the halachas of squeezing in general. The Gemara says, first of all, as far as saving the wine, you have to be careful not to sponge it up. Rabbi Brisa says you can't sponge up the wine. You also cannot clean up the oil by having it stick to the side of a kli and scraping it into another kli. Both of these are actually uvda dechol, the Gemara says. The Gemara brings another brayso on uvda dechol. If you have fruit scattered around the yard, you can pick them up one at a time with your hands. You cannot go around with a basket and gather them all. It's not the malach of ma'amer, but it is uvda dechol. Okay, now back to squeezing. So the question is, the Gemara is going to try to narrow down what exactly is the case of this machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. Again, we saw that Rabbi Yehuda said that if you put the fruits away, not intending to squeeze them, then you don't have to worry about the liquid that drips out, and it's permitted to drink that liquid on Shabbos. So what is the case of this machlokes? What type of fruits are we talking about? So the Gemara starts off and says, Rabbi Yehuda Mishmuel says that the machlokes is only in the case of regular fruits. If it will be grapes or olives, which people often squeeze, Rabbi Yehuda would agree that it's also to use the liquid that drips out, because you may change your mind and say you want to squeeze them, because these are very commonly squeezed. Rav disagrees. Rav says no. Rabbi Yehuda argues on even by olives and grapes. He says even in that case, the liquid that drips out, you are allowed to use. You don't have to be afraid the guy's going to change his mind and start to squeeze them. Rabbi Yochanan says they're arguing in both cases, but the halacha changes. The halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda as far as other fruits, but we halachically are choshesh for the chachamim in regarding olives and grapes. Now, Rabbah says name of Yehuda Mishmo that there actually doesn't appear to be any machlokes. Rabbi Yehuda agrees that it's a problem. You can't use the liquid that it drips out even if you stored it for fruits in the case of olives and grapes. As far as other fruits which aren't commonly squeezed, even the Chachamim agree it's not a problem. So Gemara says, Rabbi Yirmiyah said to Rabbi Abba, so what are they arguing about? In both cases they agree. So he says, okay, so let's see if you could go find the case. So Nachman by Yitzchak said there's a middle case. The middle case is berries and pomegranates. These are between olives and grapes and other fruits. Olives and grapes are usually squeezed. Other fruits are usually not squeezed. Pomegranates and berries are commonly squeezed, but it's not mostly squeezed, it's commonly squeezed. And that's the case of this machlokes. And the Gemara brings a brisa. Brisa clearly sets up the machlokes in the case of berries and pomegranates. Therefore, it's logical that that's what our Mishnah is referring to as well. The brisa clearly says in the case of grapes and olives, there is no machlokes. Yehuda agrees that it's a problem. The brisa just leaves out anything about the case of other fruits. So therefore, it's not a complete raya, because it could be that according to this brisa, in the case of other fruits, Yehuda and the Chachamim do argue. But it does make it logical that this answer is correct. Now, this brisa did add one thing, though. The brisa divided the type of storage you would have for them into three. We had only talked about if you have it stored intended to be used for squeezing, or if you have the fruit stored intended to be used for eating. The Gemara talks about this brisa talks about a third case where you did not have any intent in mind. You stored it away without anything specific. So the brisa says that Rabbi Yehuda would say that case it is also forbidden. Rabbi Yehuda said it's only permitted if it was specifically stored with intent to be eaten and not to be squeezed. And this the Gemara challenges now. The Gemara says this is really true. That Rabbi Yehuda holds that if you put something away without intent, that's considered to be just like intent to squeeze, and it would be forbidden to use the liquid that runs out of that. And the Gemara is going to go into a whole different sugi here, quoting a Mishnah, and this goes deep into the next daf, so we will stop the discussion here.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.